was born at the intersection of East and West. When you look at my parents, you will see that my mother is actually an African-American woman with family roots in Magee, Mississippi. My father is actually a Sikh American Indian. His family is from Punjab, India. When you looked at my house, it looked like every other home on the block. But when you actually got into my house, you would see that it functioned very differently. In my home, East met West. My house functioned like an Indian village and an American city block. We were perpetually hosting extended family and friends, and at any given time, we could have up to 30 people living in that house. We would cram in aunties and uncles and cousins and grandparents into that 3-bedroom 1950s ranch-style home. And so you can imagine, with 30 people in that house, there was always a constant murmur of noises and voices. My grandmother would be doing her daily prayers in the back room, chanting, and there would be pulsating music, R&B music, coming from the kitchen. The children would be running through the house, screaming in English, and the adults would be telling us to be quiet in Punjabi. Chup kara! As soon as you walked into the house, your clothes and your skin would take on the flavor of our fusion cuisine. My mom would be in the kitchen stirring a big pot of grits and watching her cornbread and flipping roti with the other hand on an open fire. Around 9 o'clock, my dad would come home. He would stroke his long beard, and he would take off his red turban, and then he would gather us all together into the living room. We would sit on the floor, and that is where we would have dinner because there was no table big enough for my family. And there on that floor, where East met West, where black met brown, where we would say Baptist prayers underneath our large pictures of the gurus before eating mac and cheese and curry chicken, is where I learned to be a bridge builder. You see, the adults in my home depended on me to translate in that home. They depended on me to translate the languages and the customs and the cultures, and so it was my responsibility to show everybody how my daddy would wrap his turban every day and why Big Mama would rock her crowns on Sunday morning. And I loved being the bridge builder in that home. I loved being able to be in that space and bringing together two groups of people that I absolutely adored. I loved being able to create a bridge where we could go from one side to the other side, and I could be the person who was the guide. And because I grew up in a home that really encouraged this kind of exploration, I was excited about seeing the rest of the world. I was anxious to see the rest of the world. And so when the first day of school actually came, you could not contain my excitement. The night before, I actually laid out my dress and my shoes, and I packed and unpacked my backpack like 10 times. And then on the morning of school starting, I got up before anybody else in the house was actually stirring. After an array of hugs and kisses and prayers, I was ushered onto the bus, and I walked up those stairs, and when I got to the top is when I realized, wait, this going to school thing is kind of terrifying. So I slid into a seat right in back of the bus driver. My home and my family started to fade out the window, and all of a sudden, I felt something. Something was hitting me in the back of the head. It was boom. And then again, boom, boom. Harder and harder, faster and faster. I turned around to see what was going on, what was hitting me in the head, what was messing up the beautiful braids my mom had wrangled into this that morning. And when I turned around, I realized that a little boy had actually snuck up behind me. He was in the seat behind me, and he was hitting me on the back of the head. He looked at me, actually he glared at me. And before I could ask him why he was hitting me, he said, "Do you know what God said when he made black people?" oops, I burnt another batch. Now, if I could go back to that moment, that 5-year-old girl, I would tell her that he was wrong, that God has room for everybody. I would make sure that that young man had some professional attention because now as an adult, I can see that he was being neglected. I would use my education to go down the list of things that had been manifested in that moment, all the isms, the power structures. I would be able to just delineate every single one of them. But I didn't say or do anything because I was a child. All I knew is that I was scared, sad, and angry. I was scared that that boy was going to keep hitting me on the back of the head. And I was sad that somebody had made me feel like I didn't belong. But most of all, I was angry. I didn't have the words then to express why I was so angry. But I know now that I was angry because somebody looked at me. Somebody looked at my skin, this mixed girl, and decided to other me, to make me littler, to think that I was a burnt batch. When I got back on the bus that evening, I curled up into a ball and I tried to make myself as small as I could, and I put myself in the corner of one of the bus seats because I was trying to hide. And I was trying to occupy my mind with other things, but the only thing I could think about was what had happened to me on the bus that morning. Why had that boy treated me that way? It called into question everything that I knew to be true about the world. It called into question what it meant to be a bridge builder. I asked these questions about being a bridge builder. Was that a fake thing? Was that going to be used against me? Was my bridge real? Would anybody else want to cross my bridge, or was my bridge only something I did with my family and our friends? I had so much doubt in me. And then the bus stopped at my stop, and the doors opened, and there was my family, about a dozen of them, in brightly colored clothes with their beautiful black and brown arms, and I ran across the pavement into their arms, and they embraced me. And I remembered in that moment that what happened on the bus did not discount what was going on in my home every day. You see, I learned a lot on my first day of kindergarten. I learned that sometimes the hardest bridge to build is actually the one to the boy who lives just 2 blocks away. I learned that sometimes there would be people who would look at me and not see me as a reflection of what happens when East meets West and falls in love, but as a burnt batch. But you know what else I learned that day? I learned that my bridge was real, and that it was powerful, and that it was resilient. I learned that my bridge was strong, and I made a decision that I was not going to turn my back on my bridge, nor was I going to try and hide on my bridge, but what I was going to try and do is build more bridges. And that is how I lived my life. In my professional space, I have tried to build more bridges. I have tried to build a bridge between my professional training in business and law and social justice with what I believe to be my personal mission in life, to move power to marginalized communities. I have done it in my personal space. My husband and I have worked so hard to make sure that our 2 little boys understand not only their cultural heritage, but the beauty of the cultures that we have in this world. You want to get a flavor of it? My boys are named Zephaniah and Zion, 2 Hebrew names. They go to Pentecostal churches. They actually adhere to the tenets of Sikhism. And the oldest one has the nerve now to try and learn Mandarin. You see, we are trying to teach our children how to build bridges through division. Now, those convictions may seem impressive. They may seem kind of lofty. You may be even inspired by them. So how ironic that my convictions almost all came tumbling down on the day that my son started kindergarten. We were standing outside waiting for the bus to come, and everything was fine. The kids were running around, they were dancing, they were playing. The bus started to come towards us, and then my son grabbed my hand, and he looked up at me with the "Mama, please don't let me go" look in his eyes. The doors opened. My son started to ascend the steps. He turned about with one last glance, and then he slid into the seat behind the bus driver. Sound familiar? I looked at my husband in a flash and I said, "I'm going with them. Meet me at the school." The next thing I knew, I was sitting on green pleather seats and my son was sitting next to it, and we were both going to kindergarten. And all of a sudden, that feeling of being scared and sad and angry started to rise in my body. Now, I knew nobody was going to hurt me or my son while I was sitting next to him, but I also had this moment of realization that the bridge that I was able to help curate with him, that opportunity to curate his bridge with him, those opportunities were going to become fewer and fewer. By the time we got to the school and we parted ways, I was crying. And not cute, "Oh, my baby's going to school," tears. No, full on sobbing. I grabbed my son, my younger one, who was then 2 years old, up in my arms, and I held him close, and I admired him. I looked at my son, and I looked at his skin, and I looked at his hair that he refuses to cut, just like his Indian grandfather, and I looked at his green eyes that he has like his white grandmother, and I looked at his nose and his mouth that he gets from his African-American grandparents, and I realized that I could not protect my kids. I could not protect my kids from what was happening in the world. All of these incidences where people were killing one another because they had so far othered their victims. That I could not protect my children from people seeing them, not for the beautiful souls that they have, for their contagious laughter. No, seeing them and judging them because of the way they look, because of the way I look, their father looks, their grandparents look. And I was angry. And that fear and that sadness, it mounted into rage. It made me question, why was I spending my entire life thinking about building bridges when I couldn't protect my own babies? It sat there for longer than I'd like to admit. Until finally I got the courage to ask myself a question. What was I going to do? Was I going to turn my back on my bridge? Was I going to try and get onto my bridge and hide there? Or was I going to try and figure out a way to actually shore up my children's bridges? I decided to pick up a pen and a piece of paper, and I started to write, and I wrote, and I wrote, and I wrote. I wrote all of the things that I wanted my kids to know about themselves, all of the things that I celebrate in them, their unique qualities, the things that others might try to vilify. And I wrote until I had created a bridge, one wide enough to connect between who I know my children are and who the world might have them believe they are. When I reflected on that letter, I realized that it was more than just my kids I was writing to. I was writing to all the kids. And so that letter actually became the genesis of a children's book, 2 children's books. I am a boy of color and I am a girl of color. The books feature children of color next to words of affirmation. The children are of all shades and backgrounds. And my children actually participated in the project because what they do is they take the proceeds from the books and then they give them to organizations that are focused on creating positive images of children of color. Now, after the book got into circulation, I could not believe how many people actually reached out to tell me about the impact that the book had on them. There was one family that I will never forget. A mom called me early one morning. She said, "Deanna, I had to tell you this. My son, he's 6, but all of a sudden, he stopped wanting to go to school. He used to be excited. Now he doesn't want to go." And I couldn't figure out what was going on until one day I was walking down the hallway and I saw my son in the bathroom and he was rubbing his skin aggressively. And I said, "Baby, what are you doing?" And he said, "Mama, the kids at school said I'm too dark." She was heartbroken, so she gave him this book, and she heard him reading this book to himself over and over again in his room. And then one morning, as she was preparing for the I don't want to go to school fight, he walked out of his room. He was ready to go. And he said, Mom, I'm a boy of color, and I'm cute. And they went to school. Now, I understand that mom's pain. I understand that little boy's pain. Here's a mom trying to protect her little brown baby, and a boy trying to understand why he was being ostracized because of the color of his skin. And I wish stories like that did not exist. I cannot tell you how much I wish we were in a different place. But I'm also encouraged that that bridge I had written to bridge for my own children became a bridge for that family. Now, I could have told you any number of stories about how my bridge has been tested in life. You see, I could have told you stories that actually would have made my first day in kindergarten seem trivial. Because in my life, I have unfortunately had a lot of experiences where I've come up against people or places that were more interested in keeping us apart, in building walls, in trying to figure out our differences than in trying to bring us together. And I get it. It is so much easier to think about the world and split it right down the middle. To divide possibilities into independent little bitty parts. East, west, black, white, wrong, right. But I have also experienced people who have looked past those dichotomies. People who were so encouraged by our differences and our similarities, who were understanding of the power of being able to take different opinions and different ideas and just differences all together. And they understood how to weave those differences together until they made a bridge. A bridge that was wide enough, long enough, strong enough to hold many, many people. And because I have seen that so many times, over and over again, it has led me to believe that all of us have the power to build bridges. The question is, what are we going to do with our anger and our frustration and our sadness? Are we going to build more bridges? I'm asking each one of you to take this into consideration. Please, we need you. We need you to not stop building bridges. Thank you.